the ideological conflict waged by the communist and capitalist blocs throughout the Cold War, the leaders of the Soviet Union and of the United States have cooperated closely in the program of covert population control and have used their intelligence agencies to coordinate their secret collaboration in genocide. However cruel and underhanded we may find their population control methods to be today, they are certainly a far cry from the atrocities of conventional war endured by our grandparents, and infinitely more benign than the annihilating power of a thermonuclear explosion. Compared to the wanton destruction of war, proactively combating human fertility by mutual agreement, or, should that fail, by mutual coercion, also has the distinct advantage of sparing the physical infrastructure and ensuring uninterrupted economic progress. The global depopulation policy therefore represents a giant leap forward in the way nations conduct themselves towards other nations, in the way people coexist within and beyond national borders, and in the way natural resources are managed and shared and to what purpose they are being used. Population control as a substitute to war is the progeny of the bipolar world order that followed World War II, when the international balance of power was precariously held by the United States and the Soviet Union. Considering the deep suspicions and ideological animosities between the communist and capitalist camps, and the existential threat they posed to one another through the awesome power of the nuclear warheads they had pointing at each other, it should come as no surprise that they agreed to wage a demographic war on their own people, and on those within their spheres of influence, rather than risk their mutually assured destruction in a nuclear confrontation. American President Franklin D. Roosevelt was the moving force behind the formation of the United Nations organization, and the ideals he cherished are embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As an ardent anti-imperialist and free trader, Roosevelt envisioned a world free of European colonialism, and stated his post-war goals in the Atlantic Charter, the policy statement agreed upon by the Allies in 1941, whose pillars are the abandonment of the use of force and of ambitions for territorial aggrandizement, global cooperation to secure better economic and social conditions for all, freedom from fear and want, and free trade and free access to raw materials. In 1942, the Allies pledged adherence to the Charter's principles, and in 1945 at Yalta, just before war's end, Roosevelt brought Stalin on board and reiterated his vision of the future and his intentions for enduring peace. I quote, "The Crimean Conference ought to spell the end of a system of unilateral action. The exclusive alliances, the spheres of influence, the balances of power, and all the other expedients that have been tried for centuries and have always failed. We propose to substitute for all these a universal organization in which all peace-loving nations will finally have a chance to join." End of quote. The United Nations was born from enlightened minds and was endowed from the beginning with the noblest intentions. But even the noblest intentions are sullied by the realities of the day, and the post-war generation had the most desperate realities to contend with, both political and economic. It was no time for consensus building. The entire world was on America's shoulders at war's end, and America moved in on Europe and Japan with military ruthlessness to ensure that history does not repeat itself and aggression nations are contained once and for all. The reconstruction of Europe and Japan comprised ambitious population control objectives in addition to demilitarization, and they were achieved in record time and were mirrored by the Soviets in their own sphere of influence and with even greater ruthlessness. Once the world's industrial nations were tamed with fluoride and tough love, within 20 years of war's end, the U.S. focused on Latin America. Since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, the Western Hemisphere had been America's concern. The depopulation project had in the meantime passed into the hands of a new generation that was led with unprecedented fervor by Nelson and David Rockefeller, Richard Nixon, and Henry Kissinger. By 1980, every country in Latin America, save for Bolivia, Paraguay, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Haiti, had adopted the same covert methods of chemical sterilization as the West had done before them. The depopulation project had become global, and its globalization was firmly entrenched in America's foreign policy statement under the cover of security. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the lifting of the Iron Curtain, and the gradual absorption of formerly communist nations into the European Union, the threat of nuclear confrontation disappeared, and the justification for depopulation shifted from national security and international peace to environmental preservation. Avoiding ecological collapse and preserving natural resources for future generations is a genuine concern that has traction with people outside the political and military arenas, which is why consensus building on the need for depopulation has become easier than ever before and has brought on board environmentalists, scientists, religious leaders, celebrities, jurists, businessmen, journalists, and even people from all walks of life. What demographers and world leaders saw 7 decades ago is now obvious to anyone willing to look at the world from a global perspective and capable of honesty. That is why global depopulation policy has passed from the hands of a few enlightened leaders into the hands of civil society and a much broader international community. While many of the newcomers are unaware that covert chemical and biological sterilization agents are responsible for lower birth rates and stable populations in the developed world, and not prosperity and education as it is being asserted in order to deceive the public, others know but are unwilling to admit it openly, and some even to themselves, lest they should have to confront their consciences and the unpleasant reality that by their silence they are complicit in crimes against humanity and genocide. This is an inconvenient truth. It is far easier and far more to their advantage to go with the flow and benefit from joining the system already in place, rather than attempt to bring the con into the open so as to change the methodology of the global depopulation policy from covert, immoral, and involuntary poisoning to overt, ethical, and consensual legislation. And so we march ahead towards our self-destruction because the best among us lack the courage to stand up and speak the truth, to go against the grain, and because they have long stopped trusting in their fellow man and in their own ability to challenge the status quo. In a society where every man is for himself, every man cares only for himself, in a world of giant institutions, the individual has become an insignificant speck of dust. The institutional machinery was set in motion nearly 7 decades ago and has gathered such momentum that even those at the helm of the international community are powerless to stop it. Thousands of NGOs are now involved in the global depopulation policy, 7,000 at the last count, each carrying out a small part of this global genocide and doing so in the name of aid and humanitarian work. In 1983, the UN spun a satellite organization called the World Commission on Environment and Development, or more commonly known as the Brundtland Commission, to focus on environmental problems and solutions. The Brundtland Report, published in 1987, came up with a course of action to avoid the dire predictions of environmental catastrophe. Its predictions are encapsulated by the term sustainable development, which has become the catchword for the environmental movement and the euphemism behind which depopulation measures, along with decarbonization efforts, have been hidden ever since. The report's analysis and prescriptions are extraordinarily valuable, and it is not my intention to throw it into a negative light. My only criticism is that it does not bring the global depopulation policy into the open, but rather hides it behind a new curtain, that of sustainable development. The Brundtland Report was followed by Agenda 21, a non-binding, voluntarily implemented action plan with respect to sustainable development / depopulation that was developed by the United Nations, multilateral organizations, and national governments at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 to combat poverty and pollution, conserve natural resources, and develop in a sustainable manner. In effect, Agenda 21 represents a global expansion of the Western socio-economic formula for prosperity, which hinges on covertly controlling population growth. To make it palatable to the masses of the developing world, however, the promise of prosperity was made without disclosing that prosperity depends on first achieving low fertility. That is to say, the people of the developing world were not told that their reproductive rights will be taken away from them so that they too can attain prosperity. That inconvenient truth was preserved only for the statesmen of the developing world, whose collaboration the UN and its Western sponsors need in order to covertly poison the people of the developing world. The same way the people of the developed world have been poisoned since the end of the Second World War. The voluntary objectives of Agenda 21 were made enforceable in 2000 by the Millennium Development Goals, when 189 UN member states and 23 international organizations pledged to 1. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. 2. Achieve universal primary education. 3. Promote gender equality and empower women. 4. Reduce child mortality rates. 5. Improve maternal health. 6. Combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. 7. Ensure environmental sustainability. And 8. Develop a global partnership for development, all of which hinge on one and one thing only: halting population growth and reducing the global population. The Millennium Development Goals are a concrete roadmap that sets specific targets and shows how to achieve them. It is an ambitious and worthy plan, but just like Agenda 21, it is dishonest because it refuses to state the obvious, namely that at its core lays the global depopulation policy. The world is about to embark upon the Sustainable Development Goals, and we cannot allow covert methods of depopulation to continue. The depopulation effort must be brought out into the open, all covert methods of population control must be shut down, and replacement level fertility must be legislated across the world as a planetary security prerogative. If we fail to do this, the incidence and severity of non-communicable diseases will explode threefold by 2050, and the vast majority of mankind will be shut out of procreation and condemned to lives of chronic illness and to enfeebled minds. Already nearly a quarter of the populace of developed nations is infertile, and according to the latest statistics, nearly half remain childless. This methodology of combating population growth is not only killing us, it is also killing the planet. By continuing with the business-as-usual model, we are not only endangering our own kind, but all life on Earth. Already we have exceeded the safe margins for 2 of the 9 planetary boundaries identified by environmental scientists, the biodiversity and the phosphorus-nitrogen cycle, and we are pushing the thresholds for 2 more planetary boundaries, climate and land use. The justification for population control measures has evolved with the times and with the circumstances from a peace preservation measure to a national economic security measure, and finally to an environmental protection measure. All 3 justifications are as valid now as when they were first rationalized. The program of controlling the global population, which I have baptized the global depopulation policy, is known by insiders under the euphemism demographic transition. The demographic transition is a multi-generational plan with 3 distinct phases. Phase 1, the population control phase, which started in 1945 and lasted until the year 2000, sought to reduce the total fertility rate of every nation on Earth to 2 children only, the so-called replacement level fertility. It has succeeded in most countries, save for sub-Saharan Africa and a few other countries around the world. The population stabilization phase, which started in 2000 and will be completed by 2050, seeks to ensure that the global population peaks at 9 or 10 billion by 2040